Joshua grew up in a humble neighborhood where life moved slowly and quietly, and where family meant everything. His parents were the kind of people who believed in the honest dignity of a hard day's work. His father, a mechanic with calloused hands and a deep, quiet strength, would come home every evening smelling of oil and steel, while his mother, a school teacher, infused their small home with warmth, laughter, and the scent of her cinnamon apple pie. They taught Joshua that success wasn't measured in bank balances or designer clothes, but in the way you treated others, with kindness, humility, and grace. They showed him that character mattered more than reputation, and that love was something you nurtured through small acts of devotion. In that modest home, filled with mismatched furniture and second-hand books, Joshua learned the value of perseverance. Even when times were hard, even when money was tight and dreams seemed far off, his parents never let go of hope. They celebrated the little things: a good report card, a sunny day, a home-cooked meal shared around the table. These moments, though simple, were woven with joy, and they laid the foundation for who Joshua would become. But this deeply grounded upbringing also sheltered him from a world that operated by a different set of rules, a world where power, appearances, and wealth dictated one's worth. In the world he knew, life was rich not because of luxury, but because of togetherness. The beauty of simplicity was not lost on Joshua. In fact, it was where he found the greatest meaning. There was a purity to the way his family faced challenges. They tackled hardships side by side, weathered storms with laughter, and leaned on one another when the weight of life grew heavy. It was in shared struggles that they built their strongest memories, patching up the roof during a thunderstorm, finding creative ways to stretch a meal during lean times, or rallying together when someone was sick. These weren't just moments of survival, they were threads of love and resilience that stitched their lives together. The small victories, like fixing the old car with his dad or baking bread from scratch with his mum, felt monumental. There was no need for extravagance when contentment came from the joy of effort, the pride in helping one another, and the stories told around the dinner table. Life was full of meaning precisely because it wasn't perfect. It was real, raw, and shared. In those quiet, unpolished moments, Joshua learned what it truly meant to be wealthy, not in things, but in spirit. And while he didn't know it then, the richness of that life would one day be the thing that saved him. When he met her, everything changed. They crossed paths on an ordinary afternoon in the most unassuming of places, a quiet local bookstore, tucked between a laundromat and a florist, the kind of place you could walk by 100 times without noticing. She was sitting cross-legged in the poetry section, thumbing through a worn copy of Mary Oliver. Joshua had stopped by to browse gardening books for his mother. Their eyes met briefly across the shelves, and what followed wasn't the spark of some cinematic love-at-first-sight moment, but something gentler, grounded, real. It started with a shared smile and a shy conversation about favorite writers. That day, they talked for nearly an hour and left the store with more laughter than literature. Their courtship was quiet and slow. They took long walks through parks, cooked together in small kitchens, and spent lazy Sundays reading or watching old movies on her couch. There were no grand gestures, no social media announcements, no extravagant dates, just two souls enjoying each other's company in the simplicity of shared time. And surprisingly, it was she who craved this life most. Though she had grown up in wealth and grandeur, she confessed that she often felt trapped by it, like her life was scripted by expectations she never agreed to. With Joshua, she felt seen, grounded, and safe. "I don't want more," she once told him, resting her head on his shoulder after a sunset walk. "I just want this, something real." For Joshua, She seemed like a dream. He didn't want drama, didn't crave wealth or power. He simply wanted someone to walk beside him, to laugh with over dinner, to build a life of peace and meaning. He thought they had found that together. In those early days, they both believed they were building something solid, a sanctuary from the world. She was radiant, confident, and unlike anyone he had ever known. Her smile lit up the room, but it was her effortless grace and poise that mesmerized him. She moved through life like she belonged on the cover of a magazine, and Joshua was enthralled. Her family lived in a world he had only glimpsed in movies, a mansion perched atop a hill, attended by staff, filled with artwork worth more than his childhood home. Their cars were imported, their holidays exotic, their problems hidden behind thick curtains and manicured facades. At first, Joshua felt like he was dreaming. Being with her felt like winning the golden ticket to a life of privilege and excitement. Yet, beneath that glittering surface, there were signs he chose not to see. Her family, while outwardly charming, carried an undercurrent of judgment. Every compliment came with a caveat, every conversation a quiet test of his background and behavior. Still, he smiled, trying to win them over, believing that love could overcome even the most glaring socio-economic gap. He wore tailored suits to fit in, laughed at jokes he didn't understand, and nodded along to dinner conversations filled with business jargon and stock market chatter. He told himself he could grow into this life, but in truth, it always felt like trying to wear a suit tailored for someone else. Never quite fitting, never fully comfortable. The grand dinners, the curated conversations, the endless parade of luxury cars and hollow praise were all at odds with the values he had been raised with. He found himself nodding along to shallow exchanges about property deals and prestige schools while silently longing for the sincerity of simpler times. Each social gathering felt more like a performance than a connection. Beneath the marble floors and designer wallpaper, he couldn't find peace. He could feel himself changing, and not for the better. What many people don't understand is that immense wealth can breed more than comfort. It can foster paranoia, isolation, and a self-centered view of the world. Joshua began to witness this firsthand. He watched people around her constantly scan rooms for threats or opportunities, not friends. He saw how status overtook sincerity, how guarded and calculating even small interactions became. And slowly, he worried he was becoming like them. He caught himself second-guessing motives, guarding his words, fearing vulnerability. It gnawed at him quietly, the fear that the longer he stayed, the more he might lose the very parts of himself that made life meaningful. He never imagined it might swallow him whole. As the wedding drew closer, a shadow fell across their love story. One evening, over dinner in their private wine cellar, her father presented him with a sleek leather folder containing the prenuptial agreement. There was no discussion, no preamble, just a cold, transactional document with precise clauses and legal jargon. Joshua's heart sank. The air turned heavy, the wine sour on his tongue. The document was clear and unapologetic. Lottery winnings would be considered separate property. Marital assets would be divided in a manner that left him with scraps. It wasn't a union. It was a contract of control. Joshua felt a storm inside him. Shame, confusion, disappointment, and something darker he couldn't yet name. He looked at his fiancée, his heart heavy with hope, silently begging her for reassurance, for a flicker of shared discomfort, anything to let him know that she too felt the weight of what they were being asked to do. But she only offered a thin smile and a gentle squeeze of the hand, as if to say, "It's nothing, just sign it." There was no struggle in her expression, no hesitation, only a composed calm that unnerved him more than any outburst could have. In that moment, a fracture formed beneath the surface of their love. He felt a quiet betrayal sink into his bones. The woman he believed had craved simplicity, who once whispered that she didn't want more than quiet joy and honest love, was now part of something cold and calculated. He didn't understand it, and perhaps he never would. There was something hidden behind her loving exterior, a quiet steeliness, a guarded instinct, something ancient and rooted in her world of privilege. It wasn't malice, not exactly. It was self-protection shaped by greed, by fear, by generations of wealth that taught her not to trust, not to give freely. Joshua signed the document, whether out of love, naivety, or a desperate fear of losing the version of her he once knew. He signed away his future. The ink dried quickly, but the dread stayed with him, curling tightly in his chest like a stone. It was an invisible weight he carried down the aisle, already suspecting, somewhere deep inside, that something had shifted forever. Months into the marriage, lightning struck. She won the lottery. It was the most unlikely of events, made even more surreal by how casually it began. She had never been one to entertain the idea of playing the lottery. In fact, she used to scoff at it, calling it a tax on the poor, a meaningless habit for people desperate to escape their circumstances. After all, her family already had everything they could ever want: a fortune spanning generations, a lifestyle drenched in privilege. There was no need for more, no space in her life for whims like lottery tickets. But on that particular Tuesday, something shifted. She had just left a tense charity board meeting and stopped at a small gas station to fill up her car, a rare outing for someone used to a driver. Inside, bored and restless, she picked up a ticket on a whim. Maybe it was the bright colors, or the awkward charm of the cashier, or maybe she just wanted to feel something unpredictable for once. Without thinking, she added it to her purchases, laughing as she tucked it into her handbag. Later that evening, with rain tapping against the windows and a movie humming in the background, she remembered it. They checked the numbers together, more for amusement than anything else. The moment was almost absurd. Joshua read the digits aloud, and one by one, they matched. Her eyes widened, her breath caught. Silence fell before it was broken by her scream. She had won. She laughed, cried, and danced barefoot across the hardwood floors. Joshua held her as they spun around, both dizzy with disbelief. It was surreal, a moment plucked from fantasy, but even in that whirlwind of euphoria, a chill ran through him. Something in her eyes shifted as she clutched that ticket. Something fierce, protective, almost possessive. And deep down, he felt the first tremor of what that piece of paper might mean for the life they had built together. It happened on a rainy Tuesday. She came home soaked but radiant, waving the ticket like a winning sword. The numbers matched. She screamed, cried, danced around the living room. Cameras followed soon after. Reporters buzzed like flies around a spotlight. And overnight, their world shifted again. They were now fabulously, undeniably rich. Even her parents, wealthy already, seemed to treat her with new reverence. Joshua tried to share in her joy, but something felt off. At first, they dreamed together. A penthouse in Paris, a safari in Kenya, a private island escape. But as the days turned into weeks, he noticed her withdrawing. She began taking calls in private, locking doors that had always remained open. Her laughter no longer rang through the halls. Conversations were replaced by vague nods and dismissive remarks. Joshua felt like a ghost in his own home, a spectator to a life that was rapidly leaving him behind. He tried to reach her, pleaded for a return to their connection, but she had changed. At first, it was subtle, a shift in her tone, the absence of warmth in her smile. She began responding to his thoughts with curt replies, brushing off his ideas as if they were naive or irrelevant. Conversations that once felt like shared dreams began to feel like negotiations, battles to be won or avoided. She would roll her eyes when he spoke passionately about his work, or worse, she would look bored, Once, during a dinner with her family, she cut him off mid-sentence to correct his pronunciation of a wine label, laughing louder than necessary. He laughed too, but inside, he wilted. She stopped asking for his opinion. When she made decisions about vacations, renovations, even financial investments, he was informed, not consulted. When he tried to voice concerns, she became defensive, as though his doubts were insults. Small disagreements escalated into arguments, and her temper surfaced like a sudden storm. Sometimes she'd snap over trivial things, the way he folded towels, the way he stirred his coffee. And when he asked what was wrong, she would look at him with distant eyes and say, "Nothing, just tired." But what hurt the most wasn't the coldness, it was the shame. She began to seem embarrassed by him, as if his presence was something she needed to apologize for. In public, she corrected his grammar or subtly distanced herself when among her socialite friends. He felt her pulling away with every passive-aggressive sigh, every disapproving glance, and the admiration that once lit her eyes when she looked at him was gone, replaced by something unreadable, disdain, maybe, or disappointment. It was as if, in the wake of her newfound fortune, he had become a relic of a life she no longer needed. He kept trying, kept hoping, but each attempt to reconnect felt like reaching across an invisible chasm. She had changed, and no matter how much he loved her, he couldn't follow her into the person she was becoming. Or perhaps, he thought bitterly, the change had always been there, hidden beneath polished smiles and first-class flights. Then, the moment of betrayal arrived. She asked for a divorce. The words dropped like stone through glass, sharp and shattering, echoing in the hollow space that had once been their shared home. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He blinked, as if she might take it back, as if it was some cruel joke. But her expression didn't waver. She delivered the sentence like a line rehearsed, practiced, and hollow. He barely heard the reasons, vague phrases about distance, incompatibility, and wanting something different. It was the kind of language people use to soften the blow, but all it did was make the wound more surreal. His ears buzzed, his vision tunneled, his hands trembled at his sides as the life he thought they were building together began to crumble like a house of cards. There was a profound, almost surreal sense of betrayal that wrapped around him like a noose. He had believed in her, believed in what they were, and now she stood before him with the cold detachment of someone returning a rental. He had been discarded like an old coat, once needed, now inconvenient. And yet, deep down, a darker feeling stirred, a recognition. Because somewhere in the back of his mind, hidden beneath layers of hope and love, he had always feared this moment might come. They had been born on opposite sides of the street, not just economically, but emotionally, philosophically. He had seen the cracks, felt the distance. The part of him, raised on honesty and shared hardship, knew that their foundations were built on two very different definitions of happiness. And now, that truth stood fully exposed. She asked him to leave immediately. Not tomorrow. Not after a conversation or closure. Now, as if the door she had once opened for him could be just as easily slammed shut. Joshua turned, dazed, gathering only what he could carry. Everything else, photos, memories, shared items, was left behind like the remnants of a life he was no longer welcome in. And as he stepped out into the dim gray of that cold afternoon, suitcase in hand, heart in pieces, he knew with heartbreaking clarity that she had never truly let him in. Not completely, and perhaps she never could. He walked out under a gray sky with nothing but a suitcase. The doorman, who had once greeted him with a smile, averted his eyes. Joshua stood on the curb, numb and empty, as a black town car pulled away with the woman who had once promised forever. In the cold that followed, he turned to the prenup, that cursed document he had signed with trembling hands and blind trust. It offered him nothing. No claim to the new properties. No right to the lottery winnings. Just legal shackles around his heart. Fueled by pain and betrayal, he found a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but a woman named Elena, who radiated both compassion and strength. From the first meeting, she didn't treat Joshua like a broken man or a legal burden. She treated him like a person whose story mattered. She listened, not just to the details of the case, but to the pain behind his words. Her eyes didn't glaze over at the emotional parts. Instead, they sharpened, as if each injustice he described steeled her resolve. She had taken on cases like this before, but something about Joshua's vulnerability stirred something deeper in her. She saw a man who had been gutted, not just by betrayal, but by a world that told him he had no value if he couldn't match someone else's wealth. She told him firmly, "Your worth isn't measured by what you brought to the table in dollars. It's measured by what you gave of yourself. And you gave everything." Together, they combed through the contract line by line. Elena worked tirelessly, her empathy balanced by a razor-sharp intellect and a determination to make things right. But this was no simple task. His wife and her legal team had already begun erecting walls, making it deliberately difficult for him to access financial records. Requests for joint account statements were met with silence or vague delays. Some documents mysteriously disappeared. Access to shared email histories and transaction logs became a maze of legal red tape and last-minute objections. They had to file multiple motions just to compel the release of basic banking information. Elena, undeterred, fought fire with fire. She sent subpoenas, coordinated with financial institutions, and meticulously tracked paper trails that had been intentionally obscured. Joshua watched in awe as she pieced together months of bank activity, tracing funds that had quietly moved from shared accounts into trusts and holdings in his wife's name alone. His wife, once warm and open, had turned into an adversary. She tried to block him at every turn, accusing him of overreaching, painting his requests as desperate attempts to claw for money that wasn't his. But Elena saw through the performance. She knew the truth was buried in the records that told a very different story. For weeks, they strategized, dug deep into financial history, scoured old emails and receipts, uncovering the financial intertwinings that had been quietly and deliberately ignored. Elena was meticulous and relentless, but also a quiet source of strength when Joshua's spirit faltered, reminding him with every small victory that he was not powerless and that his truth mattered. What he didn't expect was how much of the healing would begin in that legal office. Elena didn't just want him to win the case, she wanted him to reclaim his dignity. She reminded him that being cast aside by someone who didn't see his value did not mean he was worthless. Her belief in him lit a spark he thought had been extinguished. His parents, humble as they were, gave him everything they had left, not in dollars, but in love and unwavering belief. He could not let them down. And now, with Elena at his side, he finally began to believe he didn't have to. The courtroom was a stage of tension and truth. Her legal team arrived with designer briefcases and smug expressions. They tried to paint Joshua as a grifter, a social climber who married for money. But the truth was more nuanced, more painful. Witness after witness testified to his efforts, his sacrifices, his presence in every decision. And then a twist emerged. An accountant, compelled by subpoena, revealed that portions of the lottery winnings had been used for joint ventures, a vineyard they bought together, stocks purchased under a shared portfolio, properties titled in both names. The courtroom gasped. The revelation landed like a thunderclap, not just because of what was said, but because of what it meant. That the narrative her legal team had been selling was not only fragile, it was false. Elena leaned forward, her expression calm but resolute. This was the moment she had been building toward. She had spent weeks dissecting the language of the prenuptial agreement, examining every clause, every footnote. Contracts, she had told Joshua, are like tightrope walks. Every word, every comma matters. You'd be amazed how often entire cases are won or lost on a misplaced punctuation mark, she once said, with a knowing smile. The details aren't small, they're everything. And in this case, the details told a different story. The prenuptial agreement, though ironclad in appearance, had gaps, slight but significant. Wording around jointly acquired property lacked specificity. A single, ambiguous phrase had opened the door. Elena had found it. And now, with the accountant's confirmation, that door stood wide open. The prenup, while formidable, could not erase co-ownership. Not when the facts, backed by records, transactions, and now sworn testimony, proved that their lives and finances had been interwoven far more deeply than her legal team had admitted. The judge, a calm and measured presence, weighed the evidence. She acknowledged the prenup, but ruled that fairness must also play a role. Certain clauses were declared unenforceable. Assets were to be divided equitably. Joshua had fought Goliath and won. Relief flooded him. Not triumph, not vengeance, just the peace of being seen, heard, and valued. He returned to a simpler life, renting a small home near his childhood neighborhood. He used part of the settlement to pay off his parents' mortgage, bought them a new car, and finally gave them the comfort they had long denied themselves. He opened a small consulting firm, modest but meaningful, something entirely his own. And more importantly, he healed, slowly, with effort, with time. He stopped measuring his worth by the approval of others, by the trappings of status or wealth. He reconnected with old friends, rekindled forgotten hobbies, and allowed himself to dream again. Because sometimes, the life you build after devastation is more authentic than any dream you chased before. And Joshua, for the first time in years, was no longer chasing. He was home.